Well, thank you, Jamie, for taking the time to join us here at JFF Horizons. We're really excited to hear more about your book, Human Work in the Age of Smart Machines. And I'll say, from having gotten to read through the book, it's a really interesting read, gets to many of the issues around the future of work and learning and economic advancement. But it also hits on some of the most important issues of our day: justice, equity, democracy, dignity, and human flourishing. Maybe I wasn't expecting to see all of that in there. So it was really fun to read through. So if you want to maybe just start us off by giving us a few minutes of just the high level overview of the book, we can start there.
Thanks, David, and great to be with you. I'm really happy to have this conversation and excited to see where we go. So you and I have had similar professional backgrounds. We've both spent a good part of our careers at this intersection between learning and work, education, formal education and work. And I've always tried to focus on making it more inclusive to literally help the systems of learning and work serve more people better. And one of the things that's been interesting over the course of my career, now more than 3 decades in this space, is that people have asked this question that I think has gotten louder and more prominent in recent times. And the question really is, why are we as a nation, or why are nations in general, so focused on this idea of education, and particularly this idea of education after high school? And it's what motivated me to explore the issues behind this book, Human Work in the Age of Smart Machine, because my answer was we have to prepare people for the work that only humans can do. Now, I came to that conclusion in part because we all know that work is changing. It's changing in so many ways because of AI, automation, other technology. And we know that the technology is performing more and more of the tasks that people used to do. I was concerned leading up to thinking about writing this book, and then in the process of writing it, by how much I had seen written, spoken about, said about the idea that there would be tremendous job loss and dislocation. And I call it the robot zombie apocalypse theme of the narrative about this space. And I thought that was actually wrong. I think that historically, we know that technology is both a job creator and a job destroyer, and that over time, what has happened in the 20th century and 21st century, is that in the end, technology creates more jobs than it ultimately destroys. But there is a destructive process, to be clear. So I think that trying to do the math and figure out sort of who's up, who's down, what we're really talking about in terms of job creation, job loss, we should be focusing more on what is the work. And to me, it's the work that only humans can do in this age of smart machines. So, look, machines are good at a lot of things. They're good at pattern and speed and repetition and the ability to reduce things to an algorithm. But in talking with the leading AI scientists and roboticists, what I came to understand is that the machines can't understand subtlety. They can't understand nuance and how people react in unpredictable ways. So, the more that interaction with other humans is required, the less likely that it can be done by machines. So, in short, I think that we have to be focused on this idea of human and machine complementarity. It's an idea that I got from the head of the robotics program at Berkeley. And essentially it says, what humans are good at is complementary to what machines can do, and vice versa. So, that sort of simple idea offers a view in which society can take advantage of the capabilities of machines, but also understand their limitations. And instead, I think, refocus on the human skills and the knowledge that define this sort of emerging human work ecosystem. So, to me, we have to nurture our foundational human capabilities in order to have a lifelong of prosperity and flourishing that you were talking about, and continuous growth as human workers. So, to me, work isn't going away, but it's being transformed in the future into human work, the work that only humans can do. So, the human work is things that takes advantage of our human traits and capabilities. So that's things like compassion and empathy and ethics, or things like our ability to collaborate, or to communicate in interpersonal ways, to be creative. And, at the end of the day, I think we're different than machines in a lot of ways, but perhaps the most important is that for us as humans, work matters. We work not only because it helps us economically, we want to earn a paycheck, we want to make a living, but also because it gives us social mobility and satisfaction. And at the end of the day, dignity and meaning that ultimately is what most workers say that they want from work.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's so true. There's many different factors and reasons why people work. And yeah, and I love as you're talking, I can hear the like liberal arts faculty nodding along and saying, of course, that's why we need, the liberal arts, we need colleges. And that I think is certainly true. And you also talk about a very new kind of learning and working ecosystem where people will be learning throughout their lives. Sometimes that might be going back to school or college, but other times it's going to be working and learning at the same time. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how you see the role of employers in learning on the job evolving over time.
Yeah, two things worth underscoring here. The first is that, this idea that we've all lived with, which is that there's an optimal learning phase of your life, and then the rest of your life is a working phase of your life. And I think we've now come to realize that those things have really come together. I'm not a fan of the term lifelong learning. As you saw, I said in the book that to consumers it sounds like a sentence.
Right.
It doesn't sound like something you want to be a part of. But the idea behind lifelong learning is that it's a virtuous cycle, right? And so you learn and you work. And by the way, workers want meaning, so they also serve others, right? So it's learning and working and serving. That's the human work paradigm, in my view. And we've got to bring those things together in ways that benefit the workers, who I think in this human work ecosystem really are at the center of the system. So, we should be focusing more on work and workers and less on providers and institutions. We should be focusing more and more on what people know and can do rather than simply, where they went. And we should make sure that the credentials that they earn represent real and relevant learning that can be applied in the ways that you're talking about, not just in terms of job specific skills or content driven things, chemistry or graphic design or whatever it may be, but also all of those things that the liberal arts faculty are absolutely right about, which is that your ability to be a critical thinker and a problem solver and to be able to communicate it and work in a team in ways that ultimately matter more to employers and to the workers themselves. So, to me, employers need to better understand, that the future really is about human work. And, one of the things that I think employers need to do is embrace the diversity of their employees and their customers and their communities. We are looking at a human work ecosystem which is fundamentally undergirded by the concept of equity in all of its dimensions, but particularly racially and economically diverse in terms of the gaps that we see in terms of equity. So, the employers need to do a better job of embracing that diversity, and they need to define those the knowledge and the skills and the abilities that their workers need, and to give them the capacity to develop their talents all the way through their careers. And so, this idea that education and training is sort of a cafeteria benefit, I think needs to be replaced by this idea that it's an investment in the company, investment in the organization, investment in the work that you're doing, as well as an investment in the communities and in the broader ethos of the society that we live in by supporting that kind of investment. And you are familiar with the studies that Limited Foundation has done in recent years, which show that not only do employees benefit, the workers themselves and benefit from the education training, but literally the large corporations that do this, it increases their bottom line because their productivity goes up, their employee recruitment costs go down, and because they better retain the employees that ratchet up that learning and work ladder, they're actually happier and, as I said, more productive. So, to me, employers have a major role in this, but they are part of that ecosystem, in my view, where the worker learners are really at the center.
Yep, I 100% agree with that. And at JFF, we have our impact employer framework that really talks about what companies can be doing to help their employees because it's the right thing to do for those employees and because it happens to be good for the bottom line. So very, very aligned there. You also write about how there's the role for the federal government in making incentives to encourage employers to do that. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see the role of the federal government in trying to encourage this new ecosystem.
Right now we're at an interesting point, right? Which is that, the federal government, given the interesting alignment that we're seeing right now with the way in which the Biden administration has come in and been so clear about the investment in both jobs, worker training, and in education. Between the two, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, we are talking about a 100-year flood in terms of proposals from presidents. Certainly back to the World War II era in terms of the comprehensive nature of these proposals. So, I think the federal government in this moment has recognized that there's a major role, for it to play in this intersection between learning and work. But it's also true that money is not the only thing that we need to be focused on in this ecosystem. I think that more federal money is going to be really, really important. I think that we have underinvested in both job training, the traditional workforce training side, as well as in the higher education side. But at the end of the day, the money is not going to ultimately lead to outcomes unless we focus on making sure that we are serving the people who have been underserved by the system. Look at what COVID has revealed yet again about racial injustice and inequity and the ways in which workers of color and particularly women of color have been disadvantaged in this environment. So we've got to invest in that as a part of it. We've got to focus on this idea that the investments we're making are not simply short-term investments, though those short-term credentials are good, very good in my opinion, because it gets people onto the ladder of opportunity and advances them in ways that better fit the life circumstances of many people. But making sure that those investments lead to more and better opportunities over time, in other words, not those one and done opportunities I was talking about earlier, is going to be really important. And I also think that the federal government's got to make sure that it's focused on coordinating the education, the economic development, and the workforce policies to make sure that we get to the improved and equitable recovery that we want for all of our citizens. And here again, JFF and Lumina have been thinking about similar things for a long time. I don't think we can be thinking about post-secondary education over here and workforce development over here as separate areas. We've got to see them as interconnected and highly related. So yeah, I think that even if we get a fraction of the dollars that have been proposed by the Biden administration, it's a transformative moment. But unlike what I think happened in the 2008 to 2010 recession, where much of the federal money that flowed to states and ultimately to the learning providers was used to backfill, was used to prop up the system that had been damaged as a result of the economic crisis. This time around, we can't afford to do that. We've got to invest in transforming the system and make sure that all of those people who have had limited opportunities or whose opportunities have been further eroded because of COVID actually have real opportunities for middle class work opportunities now and to put them on the pathway of long-term success.
Yeah, it's one of the themes we've been thinking a lot about at JFF, and certainly as part of Horizons, is how do we address people's needs right now, because there's a lot of suffering going on. But as we're spending those dollars, how are we building towards a more equitable future and building the future that we all want to see, and taking a little stock of like, how are we doing so far and where can we do more? So those are certainly big and important questions. I wonder if I liked the last page of your book, especially. It talks about we have to essentially go big. We have to have the courage to act, even though it's going to be difficult. And there are going to be those that say it's impossible, or it's going to undermine educational quality, or it'll expand inequity. But you note that actually you need to that our current system is not equitably distributed, and we are going to need to have the courage to make these big changes. So I just wonder if you are seeing some of that courage. Are you like optimistic about sort of the state of things and where they're going at this point? And are you seeing like leaders stepping up to really to take on that fight?
Yeah, I did want to say, first that I think awareness more broadly about the inequities in society has clearly increased. And I finished the book just as COVID was starting. So you'll see references to COVID in the book, but of course I couldn't have predicted what happened with COVID last fall, the sort of intersection of authoritarianism and COVID and racial injustice that we saw, the January 6th and all that. And, to me, I think it's just underscored the inequities that exist in the system. And so, of course, we have seen this in educational attainment for decades, for more than a century in a lot of ways. But we've seen these inequities in terms of life expectancy, in terms of wealth, in terms of home ownership, unemployment, even things like getting COVID, right? The devastating data from the National Center for Health Statistics that I saw a few months ago that said that the not only had the death rates increased for African Americans and Latinos, but literally life expectancy had declined by more than 2 years for African Americans and almost 2 years for Hispanics in a single year between 2019 and 2020. That is just a devastating, shocking outcome of our inequitable policies. So on the one hand, you can look at the moment and say, well, we're at a high point of feeling troubled. But I also feel like we see opportunity, and we see opportunity, and why I remain optimistic is that I think with more knowledge comes power. And what we've seen now is this awakening around these inequities and a commitment to do it. And you see it at the state level, you see it at the federal level, and you see it among employers, which I think is really important. Watching employers step up and make the point here that the well-being of their employees can be defined in very equitable ways, and that they as employers are going to invest more in that, I think has been a really, really important outcome of where we are. So, I think that I am optimistic. I do think that at the end of the day, technology will create more opportunities than it destroys. But I also believe that we've got to invest in the systemic changes to address the systemic inequities and injustices that exist in the system in order to be successful. And that's a sort of all hands on deck opportunity, David. It requires employers and the federal government and states and workers and us in philanthropy to actually do a better job to invest in the big changes that are needed so that we're not tinkering on the margins, but actually addressing these large scale challenges that society is facing. And I can't help but underscore the point about sort of holding up the mirror to ourselves in the philanthropic sector, because I think philanthropy has a very important role to play here. Philanthropy, people tend to see, I think, foundations like Lumina, the large foundations as, cash registers with a conscience. And, my view is that, of course, we are mission driven, we are outcomes focused. Many people know about Lumina's work to try to dramatically increase post-secondary attainment to 60% by 2025. I mean, that's the core of who we are. But at the end of the day, as philanthropic organizations, we ultimately don't have as much money as the federal government or as private capital markets do. But what we have is leverage. We are leadership organizations. And part of that leverage, that leadership, comes from the ability to take risk that others can't take. And so, we're not going to be voted out of office like the policymakers. We're not going to have shareholders revolt on us. We have to take the risk that others can't take. And to me, this is a moment for philanthropy, for us at Lumina and for others, to put equity first, to make a difference when it comes to the large scale existential threats we are facing as a society. Authoritarianism, climate change, these issues about racial injustice and inequity. and actually take the risks that others can't take in terms of the large scale change that's required. And in our space of learning and work, I think that we must step forward and take that risk. And that risk means not in investing in programs that are good, but not good enough. It means investing in the large scale transformative change that's going to prepare people for the human work of the future.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that part. You also talked about how philanthropy needs to take the longer view and not just, I think you have the luxury of being able to not just focus on the here and now, and then also engage the actors across the system, whether it's the businesses or the other nonprofits or other educators, other organizations. So I thought that was a really interesting role for philanthropy. I wonder, and maybe just taking off of that point, you talk a couple times about narratives. And you talk about, I think you quote the Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Shiller, who says that storytelling doesn't just interpret the economic news of the day, but in fact can create it and create the conditions that are necessary for change. And so I wonder if you see philanthropy or nonprofits or other organizations in really helping to drive new narratives, and how you've seen some of that work helping to create the ecosystem that we want to see.
Yeah, there's an interesting bridge by between what you just talked about and this idea of narratives, which is what is our role in philanthropy. And part of what you described very well is that in our ideal form, we are honest brokers, that we can actually convene diverse perspectives and try to bring new knowledge and new ideas to all of them, but also bring them together. And to me, that's very important. So the narratives about post-secondary learning and work are very fractured. They are very disconnected. And there's lots of misinformation out there in terms of those spheres. So an important part of what we have to do is to try to shape the narratives and to make clear about what we need to focus on. And I do think storytelling is incredibly important in a world where big data and the mining of big data has become an important part of what we do every day. Being able to tell the human story, the human part of this through these narratives, I think is really important. So whether it is through the work of trying to say, who are the real people who have been impacted by COVID? Who are the real people who have been impacted by racial injustice? Who are the real people who have been impacted by the denial of educational and work opportunities? That's one part of the narrative framing. The other part is to be able to frame what the narrative should be. And this idea that we need to invest in learning and work as part of our development as humans and part of our well-being as humans, I think is really, really important. And I view narrative and storytelling as a key part of who we are as humans, another distinguishing characteristic between us and the machines. Again, I have great respect for technology and its ability to be transformative. I think it is an important complement to who we are. But our ability to tell stories, to interrelate, to connect with each other as humans is extremely important. And these narratives play a really important part in that. So, at Lumina, we've tried to do this in lots of different ways, telling the stories of real workers through the things that we publish and talk about. Great partners like Working Nation and lots of others that we've worked on to do that kind of storytelling. And we've also tried to make clear that our own work at Lumina requires narrative storytelling. So, for example, Lumina has done over the course of the last decade a lot of work on racial equity and justice, trying to build our own internal capacity so that we can better serve our partners and our grantees as they pursue their own equity journeys. And one of the things that we've done is that we actually literally have published the equity narratives of the people on Lumina's staff to sort of tell their own stories about how they've proceeded in terms of their equity journeys. And I think it's a very important part of the authenticity of trying to do this work as that honest broker, as that risk taker, as that entity that's going to try to bring together these different perspectives, to be authentic about where you are, not to sort of just paint a rosy picture of who you are and what you do, but to tell the real story about the lived experiences of the people who are trying to do this work at one organization.
Yeah, and that's something we've been struggling to or striving to do at JFF. And even as part of this Horizons conference, we have students who are participating in a bunch of the panels. We've been trying to highlight their voices and allow them to be critical and tell us where we've fallen short. So it's certainly something we're trying to do as well. I want to be mindful of our time and not talk all day here, even though there's plenty to talk about. One thing I thought was kind of fun was that there's so much talk about the future and automation and the new things that we can do, and there's obviously a lot of really exciting educational technology and new things that are coming out. But you also observe in the book that a lot of the quote unquote innovations or like new things that are coming out are actually from a past era. So, apprenticeships, the guild model, and mastery and that sort of thing. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about on what some of those ideas from the past are that might be instructive for us moving forward.
Yeah, well, certainly apprenticeships, I think, is having its moment in American society, and of course, JFF has great expertise in the space of apprenticeships. It's an idea that has never fully taken off in the United States, though we've done more than we did in the past. But in comparison to other parts of the world, we simply don't have the number of apprenticeships nor the sort of societal uptake. The assumption that apprenticeship is an important part of what you do. And it's a great example of where some of these ideas really are coming back. To me, though, we need to be clear that apprenticeships are not just for what people might historically have called the trades. Apprenticeships are good in things like law and medicine and lots of other fields in which what you want is the hands-on connected interaction with people who truly are the expert guides on your journey in this field that over time can help you build that expertise. So thinking more broadly and embedding those ideas into the curricular elements of what we see in our learning institutions, making employers more aware of being able to do that kind of work is really important. Again, JFF has done interesting work about this, and I'm enamored of things. There's no perfect model, but I'm enamored of the apprenticeship levy that the UK does. I think it's a really interesting idea where employers actually kick into a sort of common pool of apprenticeships. It's again a sort of shared responsibility because there are shared outcomes that come from these things. So, yeah, I think that these kind of approaches are not all about simply the coolest, latest, most exciting technology. Some of these are really interesting ideas that are drawn from these historic eras, but modernized for what we see in the current work environment.
Great. Well, and just one final question before we go. I wonder if you have any just reflections on the last year. You set out to write this book, as you said, before the pandemic. It's come out in a very different time. You've been out talking to people all over the country and all over the world about it. Are there any, stories or lessons or reflections that have come to your mind over that last time of engagement?
Clearly what I wrote about in the book has been accelerated by COVID. And, I do think that the job loss and the dislocation that we've seen, if you look at the data, you'll see that those jobs that were lost are likely not going to come back because of the opportunities that employers will take to right size their businesses, their work opportunities for the modern era. To be clear, and this is what part of that myth busting that I was talking about. More and more of these new jobs that are being created are going to require post high school learning. They're going to require certificates, certifications, degrees, what have you, on the pathway to success. And if anybody has any doubt about this, the March jobs data showed that there were more than 900,000 new jobs created in the U.S. economy. And of those 900,000 plus new jobs, 7,000 went to people with a high school credential or less. So less than 1%. So, to me, that's an exclamation point on the importance of preparing people over a long period of time for this lifelong opportunity of human work, because it is going to require us to actually invest and reinvest and reskill over the course of an entire working lifetime. So it's that acceleration that I think we've seen in the last year, and combined with what we know about, as I said earlier, about racial injustice and inequity, I think making sure that we put our thumb on the scale of both equity and justice. In other words, on ensuring that the outcomes can't be predicted by race and dismantling those systems that lead to the inequitable outcomes. That's when you have true equity and justice. To me, those are the two most important things that I think we've learned from the last year.
Excellent. Well, that's a perfect place for us to end. So thank you very much for both for the book and for joining us here at Horizons. And we'll look forward to reading whatever the next book is that you come out with.
Thanks, David. And thanks for the leadership of JFF and the important platform that Horizons represents.
Great. Thanks.